Hi, this is your Sapnil Bhartia, and welcome to another episode of Open Source and Opinionated. And we have with us once again Alex Chircop, Chief Product Architect at Akamai. Alex, great to have you back on the show.
Always great to be here again, Swap.
How would you define lock-in? And is it a good thing? Because sometimes you will feel, hey, you know what? I'm happy with the ecosystem. Yes, I get everything for one vendor, but I'm happy. But is it a good thing or bad thing? So let's start with the very basics, which is how would you define lock-in, and is it bad or good?
That's an interesting question. So I'll be honest. This is one of those questions where the answer is really, it depends. And it's not necessarily good or bad, although, over time, lock-in is typically seen as a bad thing. We think as, you can see lock-in as good, and certainly standardizing on, for example, a SaaS product or having the compatibility of a particular set of services in a cloud provider, for example, can actually improve innovation. It can simplify the things that are happening in your environment. But in general, lock-in is probably seen as a bad thing because in the long run, there will always be some sort of trigger that forces a company to diversify, right? And depending on the maturity of the company and the size of the company, that can be a fairly big problem. And this can be, there's typically a trigger that forces this decision making. And it could be a cost change. It could be a license change. It could be changes to the ecosystem. For example, M&A situations where a company that you're depending on or a product that you're depending on gets bought out by a different company, and perhaps roadmaps and things like that change. So it's kind of important to think of lock-in as not, a binary state, but it's various shades of gray along the continuum where customers can see benefits, but they can also, have challenges. Because if a customer is using a product and it's working really well with them, and they're happy with the costs, then maybe lock-in isn't a challenge for them at that point in time. However, of course, when we look at the concepts of open source, where open source allows you to make changes to a product, it allows you to use the system in different ways and to, perhaps even fix bugs and things like that might be specific to your particular environment. We kind of see a big difference there in terms of the costs of lock-in, right? Because like you mentioned, if you're using a particular distribution, or if you're using a particular, managed Kubernetes or something like that, the lock-in can still be there even though you're using open source. But the benefit is that the chance of you being able to find alternatives and to work around some of those aspects of the lock-in can be significantly easier if you're using open source versus, proprietary solutions, which can be extremely hard if you're locked into those positions. That said, we also have seen, these concepts of license changes and, SaaS products from startups going out of business and things like that, which also trigger these changes in the open source landscape. So you can be locked into open source and still need to look for changes in those open source solutions. But the key is it's typically easier to do that if you're using open source when compared to proprietary solutions.
Excellent, thank you. And can you also talk about what does lock-in mean for open source? Does open source has that universal key that it breaks all the lock-in, or lock-in is also possible with open source?
No, the answer is there is clearly a risk of lock-in for open source, and the challenge will generally be down to the maturity of the product. So, for example, if you look at a product like Kubernetes, where you have 80,000 contributors, practically every company under the sun, works with or contributes to Kubernetes, then you will have a scenario where it will be easier to look at alternative distributions of Kubernetes. Similarly, for something like Linux, it's a very mature product. There are lots of alternatives on the market. in terms of distributions, but also managed offerings and supported offerings. But even then, it's not free to move, between a Linux distribution or a Kubernetes distribution, and it will take time and it will take work, right? And it's kind of gets more complicated once you look at other systems in the ecosystem. When you're using particular types of observability stacks or particular service meshes or particular databases or things like that, you can get locked into some of those things, and it's not trivial to swap those out because it involves changes to your platform engineering and changes to the way applications consume those aspects in the platform as well. So yes, you can be locked in with open source. It's not impossible. In fact, it has happened, to companies very regularly. I myself have had a few experiences where, for example, bits of open source that I've been using have had, say, a license change or something like that has necessitated us to look for alternatives. But one thing is definitely possible. I've over sort of 30 years of doing infrastructure, I've had the experience of having to move away from proprietary systems and the experience of having to move away from some open source systems for whatever reason. It is easier with open source, and typically, especially if you're looking at mature offerings in open source, there is a bigger ecosystem. There are more alternatives. It's harder to get backed into a corner.
And even if we are using some opinionated solutions by open source vendor, the foundation is still the open source project, So it is just relatively easier it does take effort, but you're not locked in from that perspective. Now, since we are talking about open source, and what we see is that organizations, they take different open source projects, they patch them together to build their own tool set, build their own platform. Now, while they have their own stack is fully open source, but how much is it tied to the cloud provider that they're working on? Is it how easy or difficult it becomes? What kind of complexities that leads to?
Open source software is free in terms of acquiring it, but it's not free in terms of using it. You have to nurture and support the open source stack. You have to support and work through how the open source and the platform works in your environment. Even if you are just consuming open source and you're not actually making changes, you're just using the off-the-shelf environment that's coming from a standard distribution or a standard releases, for example, you still have the complexity of how do you do maintenance and how is it going to be supported and how are you going to deal with new releases and manage upgrades in your environment and keep them up to date in terms of, vulnerability management and CVEs and all of those sort of things. So all of those things can be challenging. I think, there's also typically a bit of a gap, right? And again, this comes down to the maturity of the open source. There's a gap in the way, in the knowledge base, in the way that, how easy or hard it is to hire people that might have the appropriate skills. And do you have to train those people to be able to do the support and maintenance and the work around this space? So we do have with the more mature product sets, take Linux, take Kubernetes. It's kind of my go-to here. We have foundations. The foundations have established training and accreditation and courses. And the more open source and the more the ecosystem grows, you also have a whole variety of other people who contribute in the community, perhaps writing blogs and help to bring people up to speed in terms of the challenges and the support overheads and things like that you might have to achieve. However, all of that still costs money, and we kind of see people looking to simplify that stack and looking to figure out how to implement that stack by consuming, say, a managed service or consuming a SaaS platform, perhaps that's productizing that open source, right? And we see this in a lot of the cloud providers, for example, offering managed Kubernetes services and managed application platforms that can help developers reduce some of, for example, the friction of doing these things themselves. And the same goes for managed, Unix distributions and things like that in the cloud providers, which does help. And it means that it reduces ramp up time. And it can make switching costs and lock-in a little bit more complex because inevitably those managed services do work to make their managed services sticky to a certain extent, right? So if you're using a particular feature in those managed services or in those SaaS solutions, then it can be harder to move across. So you have to, be aware of those things as you're consuming those services.
Do you feel that companies, they do understand what open source is, they do get involved, they become good open source citizens, they make contributions, or it's like the early days I remember of my own journalism days around 2004 and 5, where we used to go and tell people that why you should use open source and how you should use it, you should become a good open source user. So first of all, I want to ask how happy you are, or you're like, no, companies are not contributing, they should contribute more. And then we will talk about, how companies should do it. But let's look at the first aspect, the state.
I can't remember the formal statistic, but it is something like 70+% of all projects and all products are built with a significant portion of open source. So it's almost inevitable. If you're using the cloud, if you're using Linux, if you're using Kubernetes, if you're using any type of observability, if you're using any type of security solution, you are inevitably using open source at every layer in your stack. Most websites will be using open source frameworks. Most databases are built on open source. Most APIs are built on open source. So you are using open source. And it should be fair to say that a lot of companies do give back. It's not as much as we'd want to. And we certainly, I think we certainly struggle to there are lots of projects that are maintained by very small numbers of people and don't have that level of support. So this is something where I would, ask companies, enterprises, service providers to contribute. And they can contribute in any way, they can. It doesn't have to be providing code. It doesn't have to be working on the code base, for example. We have, in the cloud native, in the CNCF, in the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, we have the concept of chop wood, carry water. So, this might be things like helping organize meetups and helping the community to get together. It might mean working on documentation, contributing suggestions, solutions, support, being active in forums, whether, they're online forums, Slack forums, whatever they may be. And it's really important that, we move away from just consuming the open source, but also participating and being active in the community. And, when it comes to then the code side of things, again, we shouldn't, I think lots of people might feel intimidated. They don't know where to begin. And lots of projects nowadays are providing, simple guidance on how to begin and how to contribute. And maybe it might simply be, helping making code reviews or providing or participating in a SIG or participating in the open meetings. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming. We think of even small contributions can make a huge difference because the consumers of open source probably outnumber the contributors by a vast margin. So even if some of those consumers start providing some contributions, it does help the community to a great extent.
Big organizations, they have all the resources, they have very clear process in place, even the legals are in place to kind of encourage developers to go and get involved with open source. Smaller companies, they, even if they want to, they may not have all the resources, or they may not even know the right way to get involved with open source. So what is your advice to companies that how they should become, not only number one is good open source citizen, but what benefit they get by getting involved as well?
I think, apart from the fact that you get better software and, your team is more engaged and more knowledgeable, and therefore, more likely to make the right architectural decisions and the right support decisions later on. I think, we kind of see barriers in both small and large companies. You mentioned legal setups. The legal setup in a large company might enable a process that allows developers to contribute. It might equally add in layers of bureaucracy that make it hard for developers to contribute, which, and the same can apply vice versa to small companies. I haven't seen a magical solution. There are small companies that find it very easy to contribute, and large companies that find it very easy to contribute. And I think there are lessons to be learned from that. But the key is, building it into the culture, and I think building it into the way you think and the way you're using these stacks. We need to move into an environment where participating in the community and participating in the ecosystem is important. And the reality is, most of the companies, whether they're small or large, can contribute into various niches that might be applicable to them. So they might be using the entirety of the Linux stack, but that company might be doing something specific with security, or something specific with networking, or something specific with the way that the distribution can be deployed or managed or supported. And each of those little things kind of all come together to make the bigger picture. So never think that your contribution is going to be too small that it doesn't matter. It does matter. It always matters.
When it comes to Kubernetes, which is extremely popular, so many providers, you can also again see on CFS, their massive landscape there. You can just pick and choose and do whatever you want. But Kubernetes is also very, very complicated, complex, cost. When it comes to choosing a vendor, a player for Kubernetes, what advice do you have so that they can reduce their potential lock-in risks, given the fact Kubernetes is open source, but when you go with a provider, it gets opinionated?
That's a very good question. I think, first off, just from a context point of view, Kubernetes, we talked a lot about the maturity of the open source projects and how that affects the way they can be adopted and your ability to get locked in or not. Kubernetes obviously is one of the largest open source projects in the world. By the latest stats that sort of were published around the time of the 10th birthday of Kubernetes, I think it's the second largest open source project in the world. 88,000 contributors, tens of thousands of committers, millions of contributions to the code from thousands of companies. And so there is a lot of vested interest to have Kubernetes very open, and not to have it sticky, and not to have it proprietary. That said, it is complicated, and it's not just Kubernetes, but it's sort of the ecosystem around it. How you do your networking and your service mesh and your ingress and all of those things are systems in their own right. How you do your observability, how you do your security and policy management, how you do your storage are all, fairly complex parts of the ecosystem in the Kubernetes world. And the cloud providers do offer you, and the various distributions do offer you a quick answer for that. Most of the managed Kubernetes instances allow you to get a Kubernetes up and running in a short period of time. Some are better than others. Some are measured in hours, some are measured in minutes, but ultimately you can bypass um, a lot of the complexity. I think, and I might be in a minority here, but I think we're getting to a point where customers and enterprises are looking for some opinionation. They don't actually want to have to try and decide on everything. They do want, a certain amount of compatibility checks uh, and homogeneity throughout the stack. When it comes to how does my service mesh interact with my observability and my security policies and my storage systems and things like that. They do want the end-to-end stack to be a bit more comprehensive and a bit more opinionated. And certainly the managed service providers, and the cloud providers, um, provide quite a bit of benefit here. They do give you something that's end-to-end tested and that's supported. And that removes a lot of burden from, platform engineering teams. It would be immensely hard to build your own Kubernetes platform from scratch. It's obviously possible because it's all open source, but few people go down that route. They're either consuming Kubernetes from a cloud provider or they're using some distribution. That said, there are ways to manage the complexity by using Kubernetes and cloud native principles. You're tying yourself into, how to make things declarative rather than imperative. You're using infrastructure as code typically, and maybe tools like Terraform and various other APIs to do things with some level of abstraction. And it's kind of important to do some of that up front, because otherwise the tech debt can be hard to pay down. If you go all in on, some way of managing your Kubernetes that might be proprietary or locked into a particular service provider, it can be a bit harder to move things later on. However, that said, I'll temper that statement, because on the other hand, it's also very easy to overinvest in the ability to move, clouds and vendors and software, and not take advantages of the things that the cloud providers are offering you. If the cloud providers can offer you a nice, simple way of doing your applications and getting your apps up and running as quickly as possible, then maybe that's not the worst thing in the world, because working only on the abstraction can remove a lot of resources out of your organization that should really be working on your core business, right? So a balance is needed. Work with a cloud provider in the early days, focus on having some diversity as your products and as your business matures.
KubeCon, Cloud Native Con is almost here. Talk a bit about what kind of presence Akamai is going to have at this event.
So Akamai is a platinum sponsor for KubeCon. We're going to have quite a large booth. We're also going to have quite a large presence in terms of speakers. So three of us are going to be speaking at KubeCon, sharing in the work that we do with the CNCF, as well as sharing some of the experiences of our own internal software stacks in the various KubeCon talks.
What is the importance of events like KubeCon, Cloud Native Con for this whole ecosystem?
KubeCon is a gathering of minds. It's getting the community together. We have, thousands of people that work on the open source and contribute in the community, in the foundations, in the working groups, in the SIGs, creating documents and software all year long. And this is a melting pot where we can get people together. We can agree next steps. We can agree what's important for the next 6 months, and it's honestly an amazing experience. I kind of feel when I go to KubeCon that I'm there, that these are my people, and it's hard to describe, but it's a fantastic community.
What are your expectations from this event? What kind of audience you're looking to talk to? And based on the previous Kubernetes, because the thing have been evolving, it's mature, it's been used in production. So in early days, the questions was more about, hey, so what is Kubernetes? What is security? But now the discussions are also getting mature. So what is your expectations from this event?
KubeCon events evolve over time. Most KubeCons have some sort of theme where, we're discussing the hot topic of the time. The last KubeCon, there was a very strong focus on AI. I imagine the next KubeCon will also have that. I think KubeCon has evolved though and changed. We've gone from users trying to figure out if this is for them to more mature use cases and figuring out how to scale and secure and develop their existing environments. That said, the exciting thing about every KubeCon is that a large percentage, often more than 50% of attendees, might be attending KubeCon for the very first time. And this is also an opportunity for them to learn. It's an opportunity to bring back, good practices into their organization. It's an opportunity for them to figure out some of the solutions to the problems they're seeing. So it's a big mix from experienced users all the way to users who are attending KubeCon for the very first time.
Alex, once again, thank you so much for joining me today and talk about open source and of course lock-in. Thanks for great insights, and I look forward to our next discussion. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to. See you soon.